I never thought the worst day of my life would be followed by an even worse one, but that's exactly what happened when my uncle stood in my grandmother's living room and told us all that she'd left everything to him. My name is Stella Powell, I'm 29 years old, and this is what happened when I discovered that grief isn't the hardest thing you can feel. Sometimes it's realizing that the people you trusted would betray you before your loved one was even cold in the ground. The funeral was on a Tuesday in late October, one of those gray Michigan days where the sky looks like it's pressing down on you. We buried Grandma Ruth at Oakwood Cemetery in Dearborn, the same place where my grandfather had been laid to rest 12 years earlier. I remember standing there in my black dress that I'd bought at Target the night before because I didn't own anything appropriate, watching as they lowered her casket into the earth and thinking that this was it. The last person who really knew me was gone. Mom had died when I was 16, Dad remarried and moved to Arizona with his new wife, and my younger brother Tyler was doing a tour in Afghanistan with the Marines. Grandma Ruth had been my constant, my safe place. The person I called when my boyfriend cheated on me, when I got laid off from the marketing firm, when I couldn't make rent. She always answered. She always had a solution, or at least a kind word. Uncle Dennis stood on the other side of the grave, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. He was my mother's older brother, 56 years old, owner of 3 car dealerships across southeastern Michigan, married to Aunt Cheryl, who wore too much perfume and talked too loud at every family gathering. They had 2 kids, both in their early 20s, both unbearable. Mason was getting his MBA at some private college that Uncle Dennis never stopped bragging about, and Brittany was doing something with social media influencing that seemed to mostly involve taking pictures of herself in expensive restaurants. Uncle Dennis had always been around when I was growing up, but never really present, you know the type. Shows up for Christmas and Thanksgiving, brings expensive gifts to show everyone how well he's doing, leaves before helping with the dishes. After the service, maybe 40 people came back to Grandma's house. A small ranch-style place on Oakmont Street that she'd lived in for 37 years. The same house where I'd spent countless weekends as a kid, where I'd learned to bake cookies, where Grandma had taught me how to play gin rummy and let me stay up late watching old movies. People were eating the sandwich platters from Costco and speaking in those hushed funeral voices, sharing memories. I was in the kitchen trying to keep myself busy, washing dishes that didn't need washing, when Uncle Dennis cleared his throat loud enough to get everyone's attention. He was standing in the archway between the kitchen and the living room, holding a manila folder. His face had this serious expression that I'd seen him use at family dinners when he wanted everyone to listen to one of his business stories. "I know this is difficult timing," he said. And the room went quiet. "But I think we need to address Ruth's affairs. She was very clear about her wishes, and I want everyone to know what she wanted." My stomach tightened because something about his tone felt wrong, felt rehearsed. He opened the folder and pulled out papers. "Ruth updated her will 6 months ago," he said, looking around the room. "She asked me to be the executor, and she left very specific instructions. The house, her savings, her investments. Everything goes into a trust that I'll manage for the family." I felt my hands go numb. Brittany was standing next to her mother looking bored, scrolling on her phone. Aunt Cheryl had this tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ruth was concerned about making sure her assets were properly managed, Uncle Dennis continued. "She knew I had the business experience to handle everything responsibly." I heard myself speak before I'd really processed what I was going to say. "What about the will she showed me?" My voice sounded small in the crowded room. Uncle Dennis looked at me with this expression of patient concern, like I was a confused child. "Stella, honey, I know you're grieving," he said. "But your grandmother made her final wishes very clear to me. She asked me to take care of everything." I shook my head. "No, she told me last Christmas. She said she was leaving the house to Tyler and me. She said she'd set aside money for both of us. She was very specific." Aunt Cheryl stepped forward. Putting her hand on my shoulder, I could smell her perfume, something floral and overwhelming. "Sweetie, sometimes elderly people say things. They change their minds." Ruth obviously decided that Dennis would be better equipped to handle her estate. The way she said it, so patronizing, so dismissive, made my face burn. I looked around the room at my grandmother's friends and neighbors, at distant cousins I barely knew, and I could see it in their faces. They believed Uncle Dennis. He had the folder, the papers, the confident voice of someone who knew what he was talking about. I was just the broke granddaughter with no proof. I left the house that night feeling like I was drowning. I sat in my car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a broken passenger window that I'd covered with plastic and duct tape, and I cried until my throat hurt. Not just because I'd lost Grandma, but because I'd lost the future she'd promised me. She told me specifically, "Stella, I'm making sure you and Tyler are taken care of. The house is yours. There's money set aside. You won't have to struggle anymore." I'd believed her because Grandma Ruth never lied. She was the most honest person I'd ever known, which made Uncle Dennis's claim feel impossible, and yet everyone had believed him so easily. I lived in a studio apartment in Ypsilanti, 400 square feet of peeling linoleum and water-stained ceiling tiles. I was working 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop called The Grind, and another doing freelance graphic design work that barely covered my student loans. I'd been counting on Grandma's promise, not because I was greedy, but because I was exhausted. I was tired of choosing between groceries and gas, tired of ignoring the check engine light on my dashboard, tired of being 29 years old and feeling like I was barely surviving, and now that hope was gone, taken by a man who'd never needed it in the first place. The next morning, I called the law office listed on the letterhead of the will Uncle Dennis had shown everyone. Hendricks and Associates in downtown Detroit, a paralegal named Monica, answered. I explained who I was, told her about my grandmother's death, asked if I could see a copy of the will. Her voice was professional but sympathetic. "I'm sorry for your loss. However, we can only release will documents to the executor or direct beneficiaries. If you're not listed in the will, we can't provide that information." I felt my chest tighten. "My uncle is the executor," I said. "He showed everyone a will." But my grandmother told me something different. "I just need to see it." There was a pause, then Monica said something that made my heart skip. "I can tell you that Ruth Powell's will was executed on March 15th of this year. If you have concerns about the validity of the document, you can contest it through probate court, but you'd need to file within the statutory period. March 15th, 6 months ago, exactly when Uncle Dennis said, but something about it nagged at me. Grandma had been sharp as ever in March. I'd visited her that month. We'd gone to lunch at that Greek place she loved in Greektown. She hadn't mentioned changing her will, hadn't mentioned anything about trusts or Uncle Dennis managing her money. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night searching through my phone, my email, anything that might have evidence of what Grandma had told me. I found text messages from last November where she'd written, "Talk to my lawyer today, making sure you and Tyler are set. Love you, sweet girl." I found a voicemail from February where she'd said, "I'm having the house appraised. Want to make sure everything's in order for you kids." These weren't the words of someone planning to leave everything to her son. I called Tyler that night. It was 3 a.m, his time in Kandahar. But he answered, his voice rough with sleep and something else. The constant tension of where he was. I told him everything about Uncle Dennis, the will, the trust. I could hear him breathing hard on the other end of the line. "Are you serious?" he said. "Grandma specifically told me you and I were getting the house. She sent me a letter about it. I've got it in my footlocker." We talked for 20 minutes, Tyler getting angrier with each detail. "I can't do anything from here," he finally said. "But Stella, you need to fight this. Grandma wouldn't have wanted Dennis taking everything, you know that. Fighting meant money I didn't have. It meant lawyers and court fees and time I couldn't afford to take off work. But the alternative was letting Uncle Dennis get away with what I was now certain was a lie. I called every probate attorney in the Ann Arbor area, got quoted fees between $5,000 and $10,000 just for a consultation and preliminary filing. I had $800 in my checking account. But then I found Gerald Kowalski, a semi-retired attorney in Dearborn who agreed to meet with me for free after I explained the situation. He was 72 years old, with thick glasses and an office that smelled like old books and coffee. He listened to my story, looked at the text messages and voicemail transcripts I'd printed out, nodded slowly. "Here's what I think," Gerald said, leaning back in his chair. "Your uncle is either acting on a legitimate will that your grandmother executed after changing her mind, or he's committed fraud, possibly forgery. Both are serious. If it's the latter, it's criminal, not just civil." He tapped the papers I'd brought. "These communications suggest your grandmother intended to leave assets to you and your brother, but intention isn't the same as execution. We need to see the actual will he's filing with probate court. Once it's filed, it becomes public record." Gerald agreed to take my case on contingency, meaning he'd get paid only if we won. "I'm doing this because I knew your grandmother," he said. "Ruth Powell bought a car from my son's dealership 5 years ago. She was a good woman. If Dennis is doing what I think he's doing, we're going to stop him." I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Hope, not the naive kind, but the determined kind. The kind that comes with anger and purpose. The will was filed with Wayne County Probate Court. 2 weeks later, Gerald got a copy and called me immediately. "You need to come to my office." he said, and something in his voice made me drop everything and drive straight there. When I arrived, he had the will spread across his desk. It was 8 pages long, typed on official-looking paper, signed and witnessed, and it did exactly what Uncle Dennis had said. It put everything into a trust with him as the trustee, with broad powers to distribute or withhold assets as he saw fit. It essentially gave him complete control over everything Grandma had owned, the house, the savings, the small investment portfolio she'd built over 40 years of careful living. "But look at this," Gerald said, pointing to the signature page. Grandma's signature was there, shaky but recognizable. And below it were 2 witness signatures, Ronald Beckman and Patricia Voss. "Do you know these people?" Gerald asked. I shook my head. "I've never heard those names." Gerald smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just found exactly what they were looking for. "Neither has anyone else," he said. "I ran their names through every database I have access to. There's no Ronald Beckman or Patricia Voss in the Detroit metro area who would have been in a position to witness your grandmother's will. No one by those names worked at Hendricks and Associates. No one by those names lives in Dearborn or the surrounding communities." My hands started shaking. "So the witnesses are fake?" Gerald nodded. "Which means the will is fraudulent. Your uncle either forged these signatures himself or paid someone to do it. Either way, it's a felony." The room felt like it was tilting. I'd suspected Uncle Dennis was lying, but having proof was different. It made it real and terrible, and somehow worse. "What do we do?" I asked. Gerald was already reaching for his phone. "We file an emergency motion to freeze the estate, then we contact the police. This is fraud, Stella. We're not just fighting this in probate court. We're pressing criminal charges." The motion was filed the next day. The judge granted a temporary freeze on all estate assets pending investigation. I got a call from Uncle Dennis that night. I was at work, making lattes for university students who didn't tip. When my phone buzzed with his name, I stepped into the back room to answer. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was different now. No more patient uncle tone. This was pure anger. "You're embarrassing yourself, embarrassing the family. Ruth left everything to me. You need to accept that and move on." I felt surprisingly calm. "The witnesses on the will don't exist, Dennis," I said. "Ronald Beckman and Patricia Voss, they're not real people. You forged a will." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing. "You don't know what you're talking about," he finally said. But his voice had changed again. There was uncertainty now, fear. "I'm sure there's an explanation," I laughed, and it sounded harsh even to my own ears. "The explanation is that you're a thief. You saw that Grandma had money and property, and you decided to take it. You didn't think anyone would check. You thought I was too poor and too stupid to fight back." "Listen to me," Dennis said, his voice dropping low. "You don't want to do this. I have lawyers. Real lawyers. They'll bury you in paperwork, even if you're right. Which you're not. It'll take years. It'll cost you everything you have and more. Is that what you want? To spend the next 5 years of your life fighting over something you're not going to win?" I thought about that. About how easy it would be to just give up, to let him have everything, to go back to my studio apartment and my 2 jobs and my broken car window. And then I thought about Grandma Ruth, about how hard she'd worked, how carefully she'd saved, how she'd wanted Tyler and me to have better lives than we did. "See you in court, Dennis," I said, and I hung up. The police investigation took 3 months. Detective Sarah Chen from the Dearborn Police Department Economic Crimes Unit handled the case. She was thorough and patient. She interviewed everyone who'd known Grandma. She examined the will with a forensic document examiner. She tracked down the lawyer at Hendricks and Associates who'd supposedly prepared the document. That lawyer, Thomas Hendricks himself, confirmed that he'd met with Ruth Powell in March to discuss updating her will. But the will he'd prepared, the one he had a copy of in his files, was completely different from the one Uncle Dennis had filed with probate court. The will I prepared left the house and remaining assets to Stella Powell and Tyler Powell in equal shares. Thomas Hendricks testified in his deposition. Ruth was very clear about her wishes. She said her son was financially comfortable and didn't need her money. She wanted to make sure her grandchildren were taken care of. The forensic examiner determined that while Grandma's signature on the fraudulent will was genuine, it had been lifted from another document, probably the legitimate will, and digitally inserted onto the fake one. The witness signatures were complete fabrications, not even attempts at real handwriting, just computer-generated cursive. Uncle Dennis was arrested on a Tuesday morning in April. I wasn't there, but I saw the mugshot later, his face red and angry, his expensive suit rumpled. He was charged with forgery, fraud, and attempted theft by deception, all felonies. Aunt Cheryl tried calling me dozens of times, leaving voicemails that started angry and demanding, then became pleading, then went back to angry. "You're destroying this family," she said in one message. "Dennis made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to go to prison. Think about Mason and Brittany. Think about what this will do to them." I didn't call her back. I didn't have anything to say to her. The legitimate will, the one Thomas Hendricks had prepared and Grandma had actually signed, was entered into probate court. It was exactly what she'd told me. The house went to Tyler and me, split 50-50, along with her savings account, her investment portfolio, and all her personal property, after funeral expenses and some small bequests to her church and favorite charities. Tyler and I each stood to inherit about $230,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was life-changing for both of us. It was a house down payment, student loan payoff, a car that didn't break down every other month. It was breathing room. It was the future Grandma Ruth had wanted us to have. Uncle Dennis's trial was set for October, almost exactly a year after Grandma's funeral. But in August, his lawyer negotiated a plea deal. He pled guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of fraud. In exchange, the prosecutor dropped the theft charge and agreed to recommend a sentence of 2 to 5 years in state prison, restitution of all legal fees, and permanent removal as executor of any estate. He'd also lose his ability to serve as a trustee or fiduciary in any capacity. Essentially, he'd never be trusted with anyone's money again, including his own in certain circumstances. The judge accepted the plea, and Uncle Dennis was sentenced to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. I attended the sentencing hearing. I sat in the back of the courtroom in Oakland County, watching as Uncle Dennis stood before the judge. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit hung loose on his frame. His lawyer had advised him to show remorse, so he gave the speech about how he'd made a terrible mistake, how grief had clouded his judgment, how he'd never meant to hurt anyone. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking. "I loved my mother very much. When she passed, I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought I was doing what was best for the family. I know now that I was wrong. I take full responsibility." It was such obvious garbage that I almost laughed. Grief doesn't make you forge legal documents. Grief doesn't make you invent fake witnesses and file fraudulent paperwork with the court. Greed does that. Entitlement does that. The belief that you deserve something that isn't yours does that. The judge saw through it too. I could tell by the way she looked at him with this cold contempt that made me feel validated. "Mr. Powell," she said, "you didn't make a mistake. You committed a calculated fraud against your own mother's estate and your own niece and nephew. You exploited your position of trust within your family to attempt to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. This wasn't an error in judgment. This was a crime, and you're fortunate that the prosecutor agreed to this plea deal." After the hearing, I walked out into the September afternoon. The air was just starting to turn cool, that first hint of fall coming. I got a text from Tyler. He was back stateside now, stationed at Camp Pendleton in California. "Did he get time?" the text said. I wrote back, 3 years. Tyler's response was a single word, "Good." I stood there in the courthouse parking lot, looking at my phone, thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. I'd lost my grandmother, fought my uncle, spent months stressed and angry and uncertain. But I'd won. More importantly, I'd made sure that Grandma Ruth's wishes were honored, that her legacy went to the people she'd wanted to have it. I used my inheritance to pay off my student loans, buy a reliable car, and put a down payment on a small house in Ypsilanti, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom bungalow with a yard and a porch. But it was mine. Tyler used his portion to finish his enlistment with some financial security and then enrolled in community college to study nursing. We talk every week now, closer than we've been since we were kids. Last month, on what would have been Grandma Ruth's 82nd birthday, I planted a rose bush in my backyard, the same kind she'd had in her garden, yellow roses that smell like honey. Uncle Dennis is currently serving his sentence at a correctional facility downstate. He'll be eligible for parole next spring. Aunt Cheryl divorced him 6 months after his sentencing, took half of everything he had left after the legal fees and restitution. Mason dropped out of his MBA program and is working at a bank in Ohio. Brittany moved to Los Angeles to pursue her influencing career full-time. I heard she's working at a restaurant between paid partnerships. The family doesn't talk much anymore. Some of Grandma's friends and distant relatives sided with Uncle Dennis, said I was vindictive and cruel for pressing charges, that family should forgive family. But most people understood. Most people saw it for what it was. I think about it sometimes, about how different things would be if I'd just accepted Uncle Dennis's lie, if I'd been too intimidated or too tired or too broke to fight back. He would have gotten away with it. He would have taken everything Grandma worked for, everything she'd saved and planned and promised to Tyler and me, and he would have spent it on his kids' expensive schools and his wife's jewelry and his own comfortable retirement, never thinking twice about the granddaughter working 2 jobs to make rent or the grandson risking his life overseas. That's what makes me angriest. Not just that he tried to steal from us, but that he thought we were too weak to stop him, that he looked at me and saw someone he could take advantage of, someone who wouldn't fight back. But I did fight back. I learned that you can be terrified and exhausted and completely out of your depth and still do the right thing. You can stand up to people who have more money and more power and more confidence than you. You can look at an injustice and say, no, not this time, not to me. Grandma Ruth taught me to be kind and patient and to always see the best in people. But she also taught me to be strong, to know my worth, to never let anyone make me small. I think she'd be proud of how this turned out. Not because I destroyed Uncle Dennis's life, though there's a dark satisfaction in that I won't deny, but because I protected what she built, because I honored her wishes when no one else would. I drive past Grandma's old house sometimes. Tyler and I sold it. Neither of us wanted to live there. Too many memories. Too much sadness mixed with the good times. A young family bought it. They have 2 little kids who play in the same yard where I used to play. I saw them once, planting flowers where Grandma's roses used to be. And I thought about how life moves forward, how nothing stays the same, how the people we love leave us but their impact remains. Grandma Ruth saved for decades to leave Tyler and me something meaningful, something that would change our lives. And even though Uncle Dennis tried to take that away, even though he lied and forged and schemed, in the end, the truth won. In the end, justice was served. Not perfectly, not without cost, but served nonetheless. And sometimes, when the world feels particularly cruel and unfair, that has to be enough, knowing that you fought for what was right, that you stood up when it mattered, that you made sure the people who betrayed you faced consequences for their actions. That's not about revenge. That's about accountability, about making sure that when someone lies about a will, when they try to steal from their own family, when they exploit grief and trust for personal gain, they don't just get away with it. They learn that some people won't be silenced, won't be intimidated, and won't let their grandmother's memory be disrespected by someone who never deserved her love in the first place.